You've noticed in these last few months repeated media reports about how the country's food banks are under stress. Now, we've talked about this before, and in every community across the country where there's a food bank, people are well aware of the challenges that these organizations are facing. We've heard just in this last while that perhaps 50% of the country's food banks will either have to close or begin the difficult process of rationing. Some of the largest food banks in the country, including the largest food bank, have said that they're going to have to begin this process of rationing in order to be able to deal with the demand that's on them. It's a significant problem, and it's been there for over a year. But then come the tariff threats from south of the border, and we're being told that with those threats coming, food banks might not be able to survive. Is that true? I don't think we fully know that. I don't think anybody knows. But we do know this, that within communities where there are food banks, where you're going to have more unemployment, where you're going to have food increasing, where you're going to have inflation increasing, where you're going to have difficulties for people to be able to afford the food that they did before because of rising costs, then you're talking about food banks that were already under stress now really being in difficulty. I mean, consider the rise of unemployment. We were told 2 weeks ago, before the American president put a kind of pause on the idea of tariffs against Canada, that the province of Ontario could lose up to 500,000 jobs as a result of those tariffs. Now, think about it. Even if it's not that, say it was 300,000. What do we do in those situations? For food banks like ours that have been around for 4 decades, we remembered those recessions where unemployment was a significant part of the economic story. And in each of those situations, food banks themselves had to step up and try to help the unemployed. That was an important figure, but never was it like 300 or 500,000 within one province. I mean, that's pretty serious. Nevertheless, food banks showed up over all of that particular period of time, and they helped as many people as they could. And they're doing that again now. But there are difficulties, and we all know it. Somehow there's this disconnect between where the economy is at, where food banks and even average people are at. We know that. We know that about 60% of the people that we help at the London Food Bank, and this is true across the country as well, are people who are on some kind of social assistance. That could be Ontario Works, it could be Ontario Disability. But whatever that is, they still form the majority of people that come to food banks. And the reason why that's the case, and we've talked about this before, is that those premiums that went to those programs were never indexed to go along with the cost of inflation. So what you have now are people who are on Ontario Works or on disability who have not seen increases in years. Now, this is all at the time the price of rent has gone up, that accommodation costs have gone up, that the price of food has gone up, that people are struggling in minimum wage. All of that stuff is happening. And yet, during all of that time, food banks have been doing their absolute best to respond to it. But they have watched as those people who are from getting government assistance are just not coming off the list because of a lack of income. They're not allowed to keep up with the pressures of modern economic life. And so they come to food banks. But food bank numbers have partly increased because of people that are not on government assistance. This is really important. Just think about it. Look at something like old age security. People who are just turning 60 are having trouble getting by. It's difficult. Many of them are coming to food banks, but then they turn 65, and a great number of them no longer come. And the reason is because their old age security has now started, and they're able to get that income and source of security. Look at the pandemic. The same thing happened through CERB and through other reliefs for things like businesses and others, organizations. People no longer, they had an income, and so they no longer had to come to food banks. So during the time of the pandemic, especially at the beginning, food banks across the country reported that the numbers were going down. And that's because there was a boost to their income that came from an official level, being government assistance, being federal, provincial, or local. And now we're looking at it and we're realizing as food banks that perhaps 40% of the people that are coming to us now are people that are not in those places where there has been an income or some kind of help. And so what's happening is that people who are on minimum wage, people who are having all sorts of struggles in their life, these people no longer have an income that can keep up with the rent that they have to pay or the food that they have to purchase to feed their kids. This is the modern reality of food banking. I've heard many people say in the last few months that, the reason why the social assistance help is not really there is because food banks are just being accosted with all of these people coming in for help. But that's a misnomer. Food banks are not part of the official social services system. They're not. They're a secondary system that was established when the official system, especially over the years and during recessions, failed to keep up with the premiums that they were giving to average Canadians who were having a hard time. So as a result, food banks have become the secondary system that's working, but they're not connected to the official system. They're totally outside of it. They're helping to bail out that system because of the troubles that are there. But at no point has government or governments across the country come forward and brought those social assistance premiums back to what they were initially, indexed that went according to inflation. So as a result, food banks have become huge. So if you want to use the argument that, food banks are part of the social assistance system, they are not. And they've said from the very beginning, they are not. And in the vast majority of cases, including our own in London, we have never accepted government money. And the reason is fairly simple. That's not our job. Our job is to be there in the case of emergency to try to help people. It's like getting people in a community and they all go to the emergency department at a hospital, and that's the whole thing. That's all there is just the emergency ward. That's not the way that it works. Behind that emergency ward lies a huge institution that can help with a whole bunch of different problems that reside within health problems that reside within a population. You don't judge it by the emergency department. And you're not judging the social assistance problems in this country by the increase in food banks. That would be a mistake. Food banks are the canary in the coal mine. They are reminding people that there are real significant problems and that the governments themselves have not dealt with it for the course of decades. Some people don't like it when we say this. They want to believe that communities are big enough or generous enough to be able to supply for it. If that is the case, why is it then that so many food banks might have to close? I mean, we have to be real about this situation. You can't just pretend that all is basically okay because food banks exist and they pick up the slack where the regular system fails. That's not what's happening in the country. They're no longer able to do so. And that's what these recent news reports have been all about. Take housing as an example. When homelessness really got large and people began to look at it, and there's all these things that went into it, people realized, especially governments, that the only solution to homelessness were homes. That was it. And affordability of those homes for Canadians. So we now see this rush to build in the communities across the country with all three different levels of government, talking about building new and affordable homes throughout the country in the hundreds of thousands. Well, that makes sense. That had been neglected for decades as well, where there used to be a housing registry. There wasn't anymore. It was cut years ago. So all of a sudden, we ended up with this problem of millions of Canadians without affordable housing. That was a real problem. Why don't they do that around food? Why is it that governments look at it and say, well, yes, we realize now that there are over 7 million Canadians that are food insecure. We realize that 2.1 Canadian children are food insecure. But really what you have to do then is donate to food banks. And then governments have been very proficient at thanking food banks and the volunteers and the people and the businesses and the organizations and the institutions that donate to them. But see, the problem isn't one of food. The problem is one of income. That's the issue. People can't afford rent and can't afford food together. It's become increasingly difficult. And with this lack of income comes other problems. It's not just shelter or food that's the problem. People who have fallen into those ranks of being low income, or even the bottom third of the middle class of Canada, that used to be somewhat stable, has begun to fall through to the bottom with all of these difficulties that are there. Those same people are suffering depression, higher suicide rates, also family split ups. There's just all sorts of difficulties that go from living in poverty. It's not just about that they don't have food. Even if you gave them the food, which food banks do, it does not change the basic equation. The Canadians are having trouble surviving. This is why it's so important for us to talk about this. It's not that communities are not generous. Of course they are. I mean, food banks are a testimony to what communities in this country have done, and they have done it for 4 decades. But there comes a time when that system can no longer handle the load that it's going through. That's an important moment, and we're at that moment right now. I've been talking with some folks both in Queen's Park and in Ottawa who are saying that part of what they're looking for to do if tariffs come is to give large sums of money to groups like food banks, as they did during the pandemic, in order to help. But see, the problem isn't just about food. The problem really is one of income. And during the pandemic, the reason why the number of people coming to the food bank went down was because of income. They were getting this stable income from the government during the pandemic times that helped us to endure a couple of pretty tough years. The world is seeing other problems. In Canada, for instance, Canada's GDP, its gross domestic product, has seen some of its highest years just in the last 3 years. It's amazing. Some are record setting. So we're in a situation in which our economy is really thriving. The stock market can be thriving. We can hear about it. There's a certain segment of the population that can go on a cruise, buy a new home, get a second car, whatever it is that they want to do. But an increasing number in the population can't. Where they used to, they now can't. So their car is lasting longer. They're having to remortgage to see what they can do to have affordable payments. It's not an easy time for those folks. And yet what's happening is some segments of the population are doing better and thriving, even though it can be unpredictable even in this economy. But for millions of Canadians, they are no longer part of that group. They have fallen out of the bottom and they are now struggling to just get by. And it's those people that food banks are trying to help. Jane and I are being asked all the time, will the food bank take money from governments? And our initial answer is no, of course not. We haven't done that. That's not what we do. But it's so desperate right now that many of the agencies that we assist, and there's over 40 of them, they too are in real trouble. So if the food bank fails or has trouble, it stands to reason that they will be as well with their food budgets without being able to be assisted by the food bank. So we as a board, we had a meeting about it this month, and we'll have another one at the beginning of next month to discuss how are we going to navigate this. I just think it's very important that people understand that as much as we celebrate food banks, as much as we care so much about what the business community has done, the faith community has done, what associations and service clubs and average Londoners just donating on a regular basis or even during food drives. We love it. It's a sign of just how generous London is. But we're hearing increasingly from people that they can't afford to donate what they once did. They're having trouble paying their own bills. This is just the reality of it. This is not a political statement. I'm not speaking about any particular party or any particular leader or any particular jurisdiction. It's about them all. For decades now, we have allowed the people who are at the bottom end of the ladder, of the economic ladder, to struggle in vulnerability. And now that we've had a pandemic, and now that we have had these threat of tariffs that are coming in, those people are beginning to fall at a far steeper rate, and more of them are showing up at food banks. So at the London Food Bank, up until last year, we had a 91% increase in 2 years. That's what's going on. Right now, we're helping about 6,000 families a month. We're helping 10% of London through not just ourselves, but also through the other agencies that we're helping. Those are unique individuals. Is that what's supposed to be happening? And how is that happening at a time when our economy seems so robust and our stock market seems great? These are important issues, and we need to discuss them. And there are many people who do not want to discuss them because they maybe benefit from this particular system the way that it is. But when 7 million Canadians are food insecure, and a huge number of Canadians can't afford a place in which to live, and 2.1 million children in Canada are food insecure and going hungry, it's time to have these discussions. It's time to talk about it. So we as a food bank, as a London food bank, believe we have to look much farther down the road. We have to look at the kind of society what we want to build after this tariff problem ends. What the tariff problem is going to do is reveal vulnerabilities in our system, some of which we can't do anything about. It's not our fault. It's not government's fault. But some of them will be. If a real storm starts coming through, an economic storm, those that are the most vulnerable are the leaves that are going to fall off the tree. We can't let that happen. So we as a food bank believe each community has to do a far better job at providing food security, alternatives for people to be able to afford food, make it more accessible to them. But London and many other cities are not even close to that. They're not even working in that direction as they try to deal with problems of homelessness and others. They talk about it, but the amount of work that needs to be done to change bylaws and other things to make London into a food city, it's not happening. You've heard that here before. Tariffs are coming. Food banks will close, and you'll hear from us again. But our task is not to keep reporting on what the temperature is or how bad it is. Our task for all of us as Canadians is to look south of the border and say, not here. We're a sovereign nation. It doesn't work that way with us. You can't just do that. But sovereignty is a double-edged sword. If we are a sovereign nation, then we have the right and responsibility to feed our own people. And each one of those people are sovereign themselves. They are citizens. They should have the right for shelter, and they should have the right for sustainable food. Right now, they're having trouble at getting both of those things. So let's have deeper conversations. What will Canada look like after this is over? And how will the parts of the population be neglected, be included in whatever comes next? It didn't happen after the pandemic. In fact, those numbers increased. Will it happen after this? Tariff wars and other things that are going on? I don't know. But only if citizens take it seriously and elect people who want to take it seriously, and we're coming into an election season, we have to start dealing with these problems and make sure as we emerge from whatever comes next, we not only stand as one in this country for our sovereignty, but we also stand together as a country for the most vulnerable among us.